Everybody. I'm just trying to check whether people are still in the lobby or not, because I'm being told that people are in the lobby. Emma? Are people in the room?
Yep, they're all coming in as we speak.
Fantastic. I see now. Brilliant. Brilliant. I'll just give a minute then for that to for the waiting room to come in. I think everyone's in now. Oh, a couple more. Okay. Great. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this post-budget finance briefing for councillors being provided by London Councils. My name's Councillor Claire Holland. I'm Chair of London Councils and I'm leader of the London Borough of Lambeth. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be talking about the headlines from the budget announcements and what they mean for local government and for us as London boroughs. And we're going to finish by summarising the different legislative consultations, reforms and lobbying opportunities. We're scheduled to run for 45 minutes. We've got a couple of brilliant officers with us who are going to take us through a presentation, and then there'll be time for questions and feedback. If I could ask, there is a Q&A function. It's at the top of your screen and it says Q&A. If you could put your questions in there, or if you're struggling to put your questions in there, if you raise your hand, ideally with the little hand on your screen, or just raise it, and you'll need to give us a moment to unmute you, and then I'll take you and you can ask it verbally. I just wanted to say a couple of things before I hand over to Paul and Michael, and that is just really an acknowledgement that we know how tough the current financial situation is for all of councils. We've had 14 years of structural underfunding. We've got increased demand and complexity of demand. We've got rising costs. We know that this is the most difficult time for local government. We at London Councils, and I know as London boroughs, individually and collectively, have been making the case for many years about the need to stabilise local government finances and put them on a long-term sustainable footing. Now, the budget that we've just had is the first since the general election. It's an important moment in indicating the direction of travel of the government. There are some positive measures and a step in the right direction, but we know we won't fix a crisis in local government overnight. So we'll be continuing to make the case to local government in the run-up to the comprehensive spending review, particularly on issues that disproportionately affect London, such as housing and temporary accommodation. So today is our opportunity to get those headlines, to ask questions, to find out what it means for us. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Paul Honeyben, who is Strategy Director for Local Government Finance and Improvement at London Councils, and our colleague Michael McVicker, who's Head of Local Government Finance. So Paul, over to you.
Many thanks, Councillor Holland. So yeah, we're going to present for about 20 minutes or so, and then we'll have a good 20 minutes or so for questions. I mean, this was quite a long-awaited budget, and there was an awful lot in there in terms of detail and some big policy changes. I think my key takeaway, and we'll get into this in more detail, is the government were listening to what we were saying on lots of things. And there's still quite a lot of detail to come in terms of what the actual implications are for local government funding for next year. But overall, it was broadly a standstill position when we get to what it means for your finances. And there's still an awful lot to do in terms of improving the overall outcomes for the sector. So Michael's going to talk you through an overall context and some of the background going into the budget and some of the things we were asking for. We're then going to go over in more detail some of the detail of what was in the budget and the key headlines and some of the implications for local government funding that we do know so far. And then I'll conclude with a bit of a look ahead towards the spending review and some of the other things that were announced for next year. So I'll hand over to our Head of Local Government Finance, Michael McVicker.
Thanks, Paul. Hey, everybody, good afternoon. So I'm Michael McVicker, the Head of Local Government Finance here at London Councils. And I think Councillor Holland did a good job presenting the context for the time before the budget was announced. And I think that's important because there's a lot of detail on here that goes into the crisis that the sector is in. But at the end of the day, it's fairly simple to understand in that there is less funding to serve more people who require more services, which have become more expensive to provide. And we see that in the numbers. So these first few bullets here probably won't be too much of a surprise, especially if you've read some of our materials leading up to the budget. But core spending power, basically per capita, which is the government's measure of how much funding is at the local government level. On a per capita basis, it's about 30% below where it was in 2010. So we know that we've been underfunded for quite a while, as Councillor Holland mentioned. And so when you see these gaps that we have in funding, currently this year we're looking at a 600 million overspend in 2024-25, and that's in London. And when we talk to treasurers to look forward in 25-26, we came up with a figure of 700 million funding gap for what we would need next year. That doesn't even include some of the dedicated school grant deficits we had, and also some of the deficits that we would expect in the housing revenue accounts. So don't have to tell you all, it was not a good situation going in, and it really is a sector-wide problem. And I think the difference now compared to past years is that you have boroughs who are finding themselves in a difficult financial position, really not through any poor decision making or any one-off event, but just simply that things have become more expensive overall, and we're trying to serve more people. What's also interesting is that some of the nature of some of these overspends has changed. So typically, you would think that social care, which is the biggest area of spend for boroughs, has typically been the biggest area of overspend. But as you can see by that red arrow, it's actually temporary accommodation costs that have taken over as the largest area of overspend. And so that, as an example, really shifted where we were setting some of our priorities moving forward as we put our case to government for additional funding. Overall, our priority areas fell into 5 different policy areas. So the first one out of the gate was financial stability. Basically, our argument was, if you don't have a financially stable system, you can't do anything else. Housing, economic growth, prevention, those you can't do anything unless you have a stable sector. So we really tried to hit on the financial stability piece. Our other priorities areas, especially for London, was around housing, and then we also had growth, prevention, and assurance, which was a lot about how do you have better regulation, what should the role of OFLOG be, what do we want to do around audit. So those were the 5 themes going into the budget. We had quite a few asks overall going in, so more than 30. Won't go through all of these, but we highlighted the ones that were fairly common sector-wide. So you may have seen that we joined a letter with LGA, Sagoma, district councils, county councils, and some others to say these are the key priorities for the sector, and try to, power in numbers, lobby government in that way. So that's where we went in. So what was actually in the budget? I broke this into 2 parts. So we have sort of funding announcements and then other important announcements. I'll just highlight a few of these. So core spending power, again, the measure that government uses for local government funding. We had asked for a 7% real terms increase, and it ended up being a 3.2% increase or a 4.8% increase, depending on how we think about it. And that'll make sense in a future slide. But basically, you can kind of see here, we had a problem that required 7% and we got 3.2. So it didn't leave us in necessarily the best position. But as that second bullet says, we got another $1 billion in funding for this extended producer responsibilities. And we're trying to fully understand how this funding is going to come into local authorities and what that means. But right now, we think it means that at least for this year, it will contribute to overall general fund. So you could take that $1 billion, that's the national number, and use that to fund other items. So your core spending power may be up to 4.8%. Again, these are all national numbers, but we did get some additional funding for homelessness prevention and SEND and alternative provision, household support fund, as well as the affordable homes program. So even though I think we would argue that it's not enough funding, we were encouraged by the fact that at least government was acknowledging that when it came to temporary accommodation and housing, that a lot of resources went in that direction. We also saw some changes to the right to buy receipts, allowing local authorities to retain 100% of those proceeds. So that was also a positive indication that the government was listening to what we had to say. There was also some other funding, UKSPF continuing, albeit at a reduced level, and then this local roads maintenance funding that will be going to local authorities, although the allocation remains to be seen. Some other important announcements, some business rates changes that'll be felt from 26-27 onward. I won't get into that too much. Employer national insurance contributions. This is certainly one that the sector has responded to with a lot of questions, a lot of concerns. I'll touch on this a little bit later with an additional slide, but we've been doing quite a bit of analysis on that. And then we just note there was some capital funding for TfL for some capital renewals. There was a note that HS2 will now definitely run to London Euston with some funding for the tunnel from Old Oak Common. And then we're all kind of waiting for this English devolution white paper that'll be produced any day now. It's supposed to be in November. So that'll provide some additional detail as well. I mentioned this is just a quick chart that shows what core spending power has been for the last few years. So if we can count that EPR funding as going towards funding councils generally, then this increase in core spending power for this upcoming year was about the same as it was last year. So again, details we need to iron out exactly how that funding can be used, but the indication is that this is probably a fair comparison for overall funding. Again, won't go through all of these, but this is essentially those 30 plus asks that we had of government and where we were successful and where there's still opportunities to lobby and try to get some additional wins. So again, I think what this shows is that we were able to get government's attention and get them focused on some of the items that really mattered to us, but in many cases fell short of what was sort of absolutely needed in order to solve some of the problems. But I think early indications are we're headed in the right direction, and there's a lot more details that'll be coming out in the policy statement from MHCLG that's due this month, as well as the provisional local government finance settlement, which we now know is going to be on the 19th of December, sort of the last possible day for them to do that. So we got an indication of where government's headed in terms of funding. We put up this chart just to show that government funding priorities, I think we saw and we could hear in the Chancellor's speech that the NHS was certainly a big area where the government was deciding to direct funds. So you can see that with the chart on the left, that the funding increase, a big chunk of it went to the NHS. You can see local government did all right, kind of there in third with 4.7 billion over the next few years. When you look at that on a percentage basis, even though we are still short of funding, it's encouraging to see that local government was at the top in terms of its cash percentage increase to the department expenditure limit. So again, not exactly what we needed, not enough, but kind of trending in the right direction. So there does seem to be some hope there. So what does all this mean for London Borough's funding? So again, unfortunately, a lot more of the detail is to come with the policy statement and the settlement. But we do know what core spending power looks like it's going to be. Just heard, I think this morning or last night, that the Prime Minister said that council tax principles will stay the same. So 3% and 2% for that 5% cap overall. and then some additional funding. So 600 million more for social care nationally, and an additional 700 million for general fund. Again, we're not exactly sure where that's going to go. And what's interesting is that in the budget, government indicated that they were going to take a targeted approach to allocating additional funding. What that means exactly, we'll find out, hopefully with this policy statement, but somewhat encouraging that they were going to be looking at potentially areas of deprivation as a factor, because we know that London does have some pockets of deprivation that are not necessarily addressed in other ways. So again, homelessness funding, SEND funding, those happy to see those increases, but again, need to wait to see where that ultimately gets distributed. And councils continue to be compensated for proposed changes to business rates, the employer contributions, which I'll come on to in a second here, and then just some of the statements that'll be coming out in November and December. So the policy statement should tell us quite a bit. And then the provisional settlement on the 19th of December will tell us all of the allocation details. And similar to how we've done in years previous, we'll have an on-the-day briefing that sends out all of that detail for London boroughs and what you can expect. So at the end of the day, we needed about 800 million in cash increase to close the forecast funding gap. And this was before we had that 600 million overspend. So as this last bullet indicates, as some boroughs are still likely to require exceptional financial support, indication and the path of travel was good, but the amounts are likely to be insufficient for several boroughs. So it feels like it's the same message that we're going to be going back with about the funding that's needed, the reforms that are needed, and what we could do with the spending review, the longer term spending review coming up. We did want to touch on the employer national insurance contributions topic, because it's been a pretty big area of concern given the amount that it might increase by. The good thing is that government did say that public sector organizations would be compensated for this increase, and they did set aside about 4.7 billion in funding for that. The question is, of course, will that cover it all? How much, for how long? You can see here that it's sustained funding into the future, but the allocation method is still unknown. So we ran some numbers for what this meant. So the increase to 15% basically meant that it was going to be about a 30 million pound increase to London local government. And with the threshold change, that was actually a bigger impact, because that impacted kind of all employees and that necessitated more contributions on all employees. So that was an 86 million pound hit for a total of about 116 million. Now, these are all very preliminary, sort of back of the envelope calculations, but the bigger piece that we're hearing is how not just this direct impact on local authorities, but what the indirect impact will be. So when you're going out to social care providers, for example, and those contracts and all of the costs that their employers are now going to have because of this change, those costs are likely to be passed on to local authorities. And the LGA did an analysis that thought that could potentially double the cost of this change. So again, more detail to come. We are keeping an eye on this, talking to the LGA about what numbers they're seeing, but certainly something that we'll be pushing government on to figure out how we fund this and try to minimize the impact to local government. So that was a very quick overview of what was in the budget, and looking ahead, trying to get an idea for what future years hold. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Michael. Just one minor clarification. We don't know when the settlement will be yet, but it has to be by the 19th of December, and we're hearing it will probably be down to the last minute again. But I think as with the last 2 or 3 years, this policy statement, which is due in the next couple of weeks, is a welcome sign, and it will give us a lot of information ahead of that provisional settlement. So just looking ahead then to the next few years, we turn to the IFS, who do, as you all know, do really great analysis on the day and in the days following the budget. And this chart just shows overall the changes in spending compared to what was forecast at the spring budget earlier in the year. So a big increase in public spending overall, but that's very much front loaded. And if you look at the yellow bars in the years following 25-26, it's a 1.3% overall increase in real terms to day-to-day budgets. That's gone up slightly from the 1% previously forecast. But if we then turn to the next slide, once you then factor in protections to things like the NHS, delivering the childcare reforms previously announced, and commitments around defence and foreign and Commonwealth Office spending, unprotected departments will, according to the IFS numbers, receive negative increases, so cuts of about 1.4% in real terms over that period. So that spending review period is going to be pretty challenging. Local government overall receives about a quarter of its funding from that unprotected DEL, departmental expenditure limit, the rest coming from council tax and business rates. So we don't know what the outlook is, but overall for those unprotected departments, it's going to be difficult. Now, Michael showed you those charts earlier on with the different departments, and local government was, near the top of those. So we hope that continues, and we'll be doing our best to make sure that does in our lobbying. So just moving finally to some of the other things that were announced. It is going to be a busy 6 months coming up for us in terms of trying to influence government. We know that the Treasury actually turns its attention immediately to the spending review the day after the budget. So they'll be working on that now. So we are also thinking about and currently drafting our submission to the main spending review, what the government have called phase 2 of the spending review period. We've also got an English devolution white paper, which is due to be published shortly. The policy statement that we've talked about, which is coming up in the next couple of weeks, and then the settlement in December. We think the deadline for official representations for the spending review will probably be in January, so we're working to that deadline. We'll be updating our leaders committee on our progress in December, and then that final local government settlement will confirm all of your figures and enable you to set budgets for February. And then we think the spending review itself, Rachel Reeves said, in the late spring, so that could be up to June, I think, given some of the way civil servants categorise seasons. And I would expect it to be slightly later than maybe we were previously thinking. So May or June, I would suspect. So we've got some time to influence that spending review, and in particular, the government is really interested in public service reform, and they set out 3 overarching messages around that spending review, which is that it should be mission-led, technology-enabled, and reform-driven. So we're really thinking about, particularly given the scale of the pressures overall and the fact that the overall funding increases aren't going to be huge, how do you reform public services and really those really difficult areas of children's social care, SEND, and homelessness. So along those lines, there were some other consultations set out around reforming of business rates, which we'll be responding to shortly. Also, there's a consultation around the rent settlement for social rents, which affects your housing revenue accounts.